There's a faction in Warhammer Fantasy with technology that rivals or arguably surpasses the Dwarfs. Deadlier plagues than anything rotting in the jungles of Lustria. More war machines than you can reasonably account for. More bodies than the Greenskins. And a god sitting quietly in the Chaos Pantheon, waiting. They are giant, backstabbing, nuclear-armed rats. And they have been building secret tunnel cities underneath your settlements for centuries without you knowing they were there. That last detail is what earns the trust. In Total War Warhammer II, the Undercity mechanic lets Skaven players establish hidden settlements beneath settlements owned by other factions, enemy territory included, growing in power while the surface faction has no idea it's happening. The lore underneath that mechanic goes back to the tabletop concept, if not the specific coded rule. The Skaven's underground kingdom, the Under Empire, sprawls from the corruption-soaked heart of Skavenblight outward beneath the entire known world. Every city has rats under it, every road, every throne room. The Skaven Lexicanum puts it plainly. The Under Empire is the hidden domain of the Skaven. Hidden from whom? From everyone. The Empire, at least officially, denies Skaven even exist, or so the lore goes. That denial is doing a lot of work, because once you understand the Skaven, you understand the entire setting, what it's actually doing, and why it refuses to stop. Before the argument starts, a quick orientation for anyone coming here from Total War, from Warhammer 40k, or from somewhere in between. Warhammer Fantasy Battle is a tabletop wargame that ran from sometime in the early to mid-1980s. The exact founding date is harder to pin down than you'd expect. Through 2015, when Games Workshop published the End Times campaign series, narratively destroyed the old world and replaced the game with Age of Sigmar. The Skaven survived the transition. So did most factions, in different forms. Age of Sigmar is a separate setting, not a sequel exactly, more like a successor. Some fans speculate the old world still exists somewhere in the realm of chaos, essentially preserved there. That theory has circulated long enough to feel like canon. It isn't. It's fan speculation, not a Games Workshop official position. As for Warhammer 40k, the far-future science fiction setting with space marines and chaos cults, it's a completely separate intellectual property. Warhammer Fantasy isn't a prequel to 40k. The two share design DNA, British satirical sensibility, and a marketing parent. They don't share a timeline. Clearing that up now, because 4 separate people asked the same confused question under the last Warhammer video, and the answer was never given. Now it has been. Back to the rats. The thesis here is prosecutorial and needs to be stated plainly. Warhammer Fantasy's refusal to be subtle is the single best design decision in fantasy fiction. The setting is a humorous world with hidden seriousness, and most other fantasy IPs run that formula in reverse. They're serious worlds with occasional humor. The Skaven are the proof. One faction. 4 great clans, plus the warlord clans beneath them. Each one a structural mirror of a different faction's core identity. That isn't an accident of 40 years of edition bloat, whether it was designed from day one or accumulated through obsessive iteration across every army book Games Workshop ever published. The result is identical. A faction that stress tests every corner of the setting, and the setting passes every time. Clan Skryre hits first. Ikit Claw holds the title Chief Warlock Engineer of Clan Skryre. That's not an honorific. That's a job description for the head of the faction that out-engineers, or at minimum seriously competes with, the Dwarfs, who are supposed to be the definitive masters of machinery in the old world. Clan Skryre's arsenal includes the Warp Lightning Cannon, a Warpstone-powered artillery piece that fires arcing magical electricity across the battlefield. The Doom Wheel, a giant spinning wheel of death driven by Warpstone and Warlock machinery, rolls through infantry formations, crackling with unstable green energy. The Dwarfs build with craftsmanship, tradition, and centuries of accumulated technique. Clan Skryre builds with Warpstone, insane ambition, and a complete indifference to whether the machine might also kill the operator. The output is comparable, the philosophy is the inverse. Dwarfen engineering is conservative, reliable, tested across generations. Skryre engineering is deranged, unstable, and occasionally brilliant. The structural comparison here isn't stated canon. Warhammer lore doesn't print a league table of engineering output, but you don't need canon to read the room. One faction has the warp lightning cannon, the other has conventional artillery. Both are war machines. Only one runs on radioactive magic rat rocks. That brings up the resource driving all of it, Warpstone. Warpstone is solidified chaos energy, pure crystalline corruption. It functions simultaneously as currency in Skaven society. Tokens of it are exchanged, hoarded, traded, as fuel for Clan Skryre's technology, and as the raw material for the mutations that Clan Moulder breeds into its warbeasts. The weapon function rounds it out. The Warp Lightning Cannon is the clearest demonstration of that principle. A Warpstone-powered artillery piece channeling its energy outward as a destructive force. The direct weapon use through discrete ordnance, Warpstone-tipped bolts, Warpstone bombs, is less crisply sourced, but the cannon itself demonstrates the principle clearly enough. One resource, 4 concurrent applications. That's an economy built with uncommon architectural efficiency, hiding inside a faction everyone dismisses as chaos personified. Most fantasy settings use gold, maybe mana. Warhammer gives the rats a resource that pays rent, powers machinery, turns animals into monsters, and also explodes. Clan Pestilence is next, and this one gets theological. Lord Skrolk leads a clan whose practices, according to the Warhammer Fantasy fandom Wiki's Clan Pestilence entry, are described this way. Many of the practices and rites utilized by Clan Pestilence are similar to those employed by followers of the chaos god Nurgle, the god of disease and decay. That sentence is doing heavy lifting. Nurgle is one of the 4 major chaos gods, the literal divine embodiment of plague and entropy. His worshippers are the most disease-obsessed faction in the setting. Clan Pestilence is a group of rats who arrived at practices remarkably similar to Nurgle's devoted followers. Whether through independent development or some deeper chaotic resonance, the lore is suggestive rather than definitive. The horned rat, the Skaven's own deity, is also a chaos god, a minor one sitting in the same cosmological family as Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. Warhammer Fantasy fandom confirms. The Horned Rat is a minor chaos god, and so his worship isn't restricted solely to the Skaven, even though they are his favored creations. So the Skaven have their own exclusive divine patron, and one of their subclans develop practices nearly identical to those of a completely different major chaos deity's devoted followers. The theological proximity is philosophically strange regardless of how you explain it, and the lore doesn't fully explain it, which is stranger still. The double mirror aspect is what makes this section of the Skaven roster genuinely interesting, rather than just thematically tidy. It's not enough that Clan Pestilence mirrors Nurgle's mortal followers. They also carry the plague angle that the lizardmen of Lustria embody from an environmental standpoint, where the jungle itself is a disease vector and surviving it's half the battle. Clan Pestilence is the faction that would thrive in Lustria. They would call it a vacation. Clan Eshin operates on a different axis entirely. Deathmaster Sniksh, chief assassin of Clan Eshin, leads a faction whose origin story, according to community lore, though primary source confirmation is thinner here than elsewhere, takes them to the Far East, the Warhammer Old World equivalent of Cathay, where they were trained in arts of killing that no other Skaven clan understood or could replicate. This matters for a specific reason. Skaven armies have a fundamental structural problem. The entire species is cowardly. They rout under pressure. They turn on each other. The leadership mechanics of a Skaven army are built around managing a faction that is, at its core, terrified and self-interested. Individual units abandon the battle, or worse, lash out at nearby friendlies when things go badly. Clan Eshin's units operate with unusual independence from this collective dysfunction. The lore documents their autonomy from the broader Skaven political infighting in ways that the other clans don't share. The specific tabletop mechanic claims, that Eshin units were explicitly exempted in the army book rules from the standard defection mechanics haven't been confirmed in any available source, and given the lore defender audience this script expects, that claim can't be asserted. What is confirmed is that lore-level clan Eshin is the one Skaven faction that functions like a coherent, reliable intelligence operation rather than a panicking mob with knives. The army book text itself would settle whether that independence was also coded into the rules, and if it was, it would be mechanical storytelling at its most elegant. The game rules themselves expressing the narrative reality of what the assassin clan is. The lore case stands regardless. What the Eshin angle demonstrates in the context of the broader mirror argument is this. The setting needed a covert operations faction. High Elves have their Shadow Warriors. The Empire has the Amethyst Wizards and the Witch Hunters. And the Rats have an entire subclan whose specialty is killing specific targets, charging other factions for the service, and answering to no one inside their own species' political structure. Every niche in the setting has a rat assigned to it. Clan Moulder fills the biological warfare niche. Throt the Unclean runs the monster factory. Clan Moulder doesn't breed armies, it manufactures aberrations. Rat ogres are the core product, creatures stitched together from Skaven and giant body parts, pumped full of Warpstone-enhanced growth stimulants, trained to follow handlers into battle. The Hellpit Abomination is the endpoint of that manufacturing process, a thing that defies clean description. A mass of fused rat flesh and mechanical components that regenerates damage, keeps fighting after it should be dead, and occasionally splits into smaller horrors when destroyed. The Warhammer Fantasy fandom and the gamer's Skaven Army Guide both confirm it as a Moulder creation. The Greenskins, orcs and goblins, are the setting's canonical brute force horde faction. Their army identity is built on overwhelming numbers, raw violence, and the kind of unstoppable momentum that comes from fielding creatures who enjoy getting hit. Clan Moulder is the Skaven answer to that identity, approached from a completely different design direction. Greenskins reproduce, Moulder manufactures. Greenskins rely on mob ferocity, Moulder relies on engineered lethality. The output is functionally comparable. Extremely large things hitting extremely hard. But the philosophy couldn't be more different. And that distinction is exactly what makes the mirror argument interesting, rather than just a taxonomy exercise. Clan Verminus handles the rest of the horde work. If Moulder is the specialist monster producer, Verminus is the general population clan that the Skaven's endless clan rat hordes come from. Skaven slaves and clan rats represent the expendable mass of any Skaven army, the numerical, overwhelming force that compensates for individual cowardice through sheer volume. The Warhammer community's own Skaven history piece confirms that Skaven society is divided into clans, which constantly jockey for power, sabotage their rivals, rise to prominence, splinter into smaller clans, and devour. The horde is self-replenishing because the society producing it's unstoppable at the population level, even while being individually disposable. That's not an accident of world building. That's an economy of violence that takes the undead's endless host mechanic and gives it an internal class structure. This is where the political satire starts showing its fingerprints. The Skaven economy is one of conspicuous hoarding at the top and subsistent scarcity at the bottom, with Warpstone functioning as the exclusive currency of power. The Council of 13, the governing body of the Under Empire, represents the heads of the most powerful clans. Beneath them, the clan hierarchy descends through warlords and greyseers and chieftains all the way down to the clan rats, who get whatever scraps remain after every tier above them has taken what it wants. The powerful clans accumulate Warpstone. The weak scrape for shards. It's an economic architecture that will be familiar to anyone who has ever looked at how actual resource monopolies function in the real world. But describing it that way out loud would be too blunt. So Warhammer puts it in the mouths of rats. The satirical distance is the mechanism that lets Games Workshop say something pointed without having to take a position. It's a very British technique. Khorne's followers operate on a related but differently flavored principle. Violence is its own justification, Strength earns the right to do whatever it wants, and moral frameworks that limit the powerful are just weakness with better branding. The fan community has offered paraphrases of this structural logic that circulate in community discussion. None of them canonical army book lines, but some capturing the theological architecture accurately enough to spread as shorthand. That's a fan gloss, not a line from any army book, but the underlying point stands regardless of how it gets phrased. Every major faction in the old world has a real-world ideological analog embedded in its design, and none of them are flattering portraits. The Chaos Dwarfs fired a Hellcannon at the problem. The Hellcannon is a massive demon engine, a smoking construct of metal combined with the captured sentience of a chaos demon, according to the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki. The canonical lore around it, specifically any detail about which anatomical part of the demon the cannon barrel emerges from, hasn't been cleanly confirmed in primary Games Workshop texts by this research. The community has held this detail as canonical for long enough that it functions as lore, but a strict sourcing standard requires flagging it. What is confirmed is that the Chaos Dwarfs built an artillery piece that is simultaneously a weapon and a caged supernatural entity, which is either brilliant engineering or an atrocity, and the Chaos Dwarfs consider those categories compatible. The Hellcannon exists. It's as advertised. The specific anatomy is the part that remains unverified. But even without the anatomical punchline, the Hellcannon makes the argument on its own. Games Workshop had the opportunity to design Chaos Dwarf artillery as a normal cannon with evil sigils on it. They made it a screaming demon prison instead. That decision is the whole thesis in miniature. Warhammer Fantasy is allergic to the simple solution when the unhinged solution exists. The Book of Grudges earns its own paragraph. Dwarfs keep the Damaz Kron, the Great Book of Grudges, a sacred record of every wrong ever done to the dwarf race, theoretically never erasable. Every grudge gets an entry. Every debt demands repayment. Dwarf culture is architecturally built around this institution. Wars have been fought over centuries-old grudge entries, and the books themselves are physical objects treated with the gravity of Holy Scripture. This is a civilization that codified resentment into theology and built a legal system around it. The community legend holds that even mentioning elves around the wrong dwarf can trigger a grudge entry, referencing the ancient war of vengeance between dwarfs and high elves, a conflict so catastrophic it reshaped the old world's political geography. The dwarfs and elves were allied. Then came betrayal, misunderstanding, and military escalation that left both civilizations permanently diminished. The dwarfs recorded it in the book. They haven't let it go. They never will. What sounds like an extended bit is actually a civilization in perpetual mourning for what it once was, using bureaucratic ritual as a coping mechanism for catastrophic historical loss. That's not funny anymore. That's genuinely moving, and you didn't see it coming because it arrived dressed as a joke about record keeping. The Wood Elves perform a similar trick. Aethel Lorn is the great forest of the old world, and the Wood Elves inhabit it alongside the forest spirits, the treemen, the dryads, ancient consciousness that predates elvish settlement by eons. The Wood Elves style themselves as nature's defenders, the guardians of the wild. The forest spirits have a different perspective. They tolerate the elves. That's not the same as accepting them. One interpretation, and it should be stated plainly as interpretation rather than confirmed canonical lore, reads the spirits as viewing the elves as interlopers, creatures who claim stewardship of something that was never theirs to claim. The nature-loving elves, in the eyes of actual nature, may be the invaders. The most harmonious-seeming faction in the old world, potentially built on an unacknowledged colonial relationship with the land it claims to protect. That irony, whether confirmed in the letter of the army book or not, is structurally embedded in the setup. It's too precise to be accidental. Warhammer Fantasy does this repeatedly. The jokes load the gun, the lore fires it. Grand Cathay's introduction in Total War Warhammer III drew criticism for leaning on the most recognizable surface elements of Chinese mythology: dragons, jade, celestial bureaucracy, without the depth of older factions like the Empire or Bretonnia. That criticism has merit as criticism. As design history, it's also slightly hypocritical, because the Empire is unmistakably the Holy Roman Empire with fantasy dressing. Bretonnia is medieval France with a chivalry cult bolted on, and Tylea is Renaissance Italy filtered through mercenary cliches. Warhammer Fantasy has always borrowed real-world cultures and compressed them into recognizable archetypes. Cathay is the continuation of a pattern as old as the game itself, not a departure from the setting's design principles. The debate about whether Cathay does it well is a separate conversation. The debate about whether it fits the setting's methodology isn't a debate. The Tomb Kings fit differently into this conversation, not as a standalone spotlight, but as a bridge. If you arrived here from Warhammer 40k, the Tomb Kings are the thing that will make you feel at home. Ancient warriors of the civilization of Nehekara, stripped of life by a catastrophic ritual, now waking from millennia of dormancy to reclaim their stolen glory and punish whoever touched their stuff. They're not evil undead seeking conquest for darkness's sake. They're kings who want their empires back. In 40k, that's the Necrons, ancient skeletal warriors who went dormant and are rising to reclaim a galaxy that moved on without them. The parallel is close enough to serve as an introduction. Basically, the Necrons, but with magic. Now the end times. The Skaven spent most of their history in the condition Warhammer community described, divided into clans constantly jockeying for power, sabotaging rivals, rising to prominence, splintering into smaller clans. The Under-Empire is a civilization engaged in permanent internal warfare, assassinations between clans, sabotaged machines, schemes that last decades and accomplish nothing except destabilizing the schemer's neighbors. The Council of 13 governing a species that defines governance as competitive backstabbing. The Horned Rat watching from his seat in the Chaos Pantheon, presumably with mixed feelings. And then the end times came. The sources confirm what happened when the Skaven moved with unified purpose. They crushed what remained of Nagash's forces, including the enslavement of humans under the fallen undead lord's dominion. The Warhammer Fantasy fandom documents this as a confirmed end times event. The claim that they conquered half the world, specifically, isn't confirmed in primary sources by this research. The end times books themselves would have the precise accounting, and those texts weren't available to verify. But the scope of Skaven action during the end times was unprecedented. The Horned Rat's power elevated. The species that spent the better part of recorded history too busy undermining itself to pose an organized threat became, for a critical moment, a single directed force. The moment they unified, the world couldn't hold them. That's not incidental detail. That's the argument's conclusion. Every fractured subclan, every internal betrayal, every wasted warpstone on schemes that went nowhere, all of it wasn't evidence of Skaven limitation. It was the safety valve, the mechanism that kept the most comprehensively dangerous faction in the old world from running the table before the narrative was ready for them to do so. The chaos wasn't a flaw in the design. The chaos was the design. A failsafe disguised as dysfunction. A faction that mirrors every other faction's strengths. Technology, plague, assassination, brute force, numbers. And stays contained by its own nature, right up until it doesn't. Whether that architecture was built deliberately across every edition of the Skaven army books, or accumulated through decades of writers adding to the pile without a central blueprint, the result is functionally identical. Warhammer Fantasy created a faction that embodies the setting's entire range: humorous, satirical, politically pointed, occasionally profound, and then gave it a design logic sophisticated enough to sustain all of those qualities simultaneously. The rats are the setting's stress test. The setting passed. This is what allergic to subtlety actually means when you follow it to its structural end. Not reckless excess, not gratuitous volume, deliberate maximalism deployed in service of a coherent worldview. The Chaos Dwarf fires a screaming demon from artillery. The dwarf writes down every grudge in a sacred book and refuses to forgive anything. The nature elves may be viewed as invasive by nature itself. And underneath every city, in a tunnel network sprawling from the heart of Skavenblight, the rats build their empire in the dark, waiting for the moment when backstabbing each other is less interesting than backstabbing everyone else. The joke and the insight are the same sentence. Subscribe for more stories like this.